We've heard about how digital technologies has shaped and transformed and changed different sectors as well as introduced opportunities. You know, we also know, however, that the access to good quality data is also very important. Sulio was talking about the collection of data points. Cortina was talking about how tech has enabled access. So with this thought, the access to good quality data, and looking at the ASEAN context, perhaps you could share what are the main issues that you have observed, with say data collection in Brunei, and then perhaps across the region. Yeah, Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, TJ. So I think there are a lot of consistent issues when it comes to representation and data across the entire region. But specifically, we start in Brunei, and I think COVID has really exacerbated some of the prevailing issues that's been around for a while. So for example, because of COVID, the digital transformation that would have taken 5 years has taken about a year. I know that's definitely something that's happened here in Brunei, and I think some elements of that has really been similar and across all the other countries in Southeast Asia, but also globally. And so when we have a situation where a country is rapidly adopting digital technology, there's also, I guess, because of COVID, a demand for digitalizing things like healthcare. And we have, I'm sure a lot of other countries in Southeast Asia has as well, an app that you use to scan when you enter locations just to be able to aid with contact tracing. And so a lot of, I think AI has been used to help really manage and analyze that data that's been collected through this application. And I think this is similar across other countries as well, where we would see issues, I suppose, when it comes time to developing policies based on that data, is when we realize that that data sample is not representing the entire population in terms of the demographics and socioeconomic strata that we have within the country. And we're a small country, so it's quite manageable. And when you look at AI as a whole, it's really as good as the data that you use. And when you have base, I suppose, national policies around healthcare, around COVID, vaccine access, for example, that's based around the data that's collected through a mobile application that depends on smartphone usage, that depends on your accessibility to the device, but also your ability to use it comfortably. So if you look at the demographics that don't, I guess, abide by that, for those who are underprivileged in remote communities where internet access is not easily available, but also older generations where they either don't want to or don't have the ability to use smartphones. And then you suddenly realize that the policies that are based around the I guess, analysis that this AI is using is really not representative of the people it's trying to serve. And then you have policies that are designed around a very skewed demographic. And in Brunei, it's not as big of an issue simply because we're very small. Our mobile penetration rate is, I think, over 100%. And for anyone who's not really included in the initial data set can easily be reached out to and included. And we have other ways of really making sure that our data is a lot more comprehensive. But when you look at other countries around the region and other services, whether it is commercial or government, then you suddenly realize that the actual implications of this lack of representation can be really astronomical. So I'll give you one example. When you have undocumented migrants or refugees that make up a significant portion of your community, and yet you have you are using the data set that doesn't include them as part of services that are being rolled out or policies that are being developed, then you are suddenly I guess, exacerbating the differences in access, but oftentimes it can also lead to really dangerous policies. And so when we're talking about the implementation of AI, whether it is in a commercial setting or across government services, it is really important for us to be aware of the limitations of the data that we're using, as well as the implications of not really representing not just those that weren't included, but those included in an accurate way. And so I'll give you another example. When we're looking at gender representation, this is something that's always been an issue, regardless of whether or not it is using deep tech or just even traditional design when you're looking at car seats. So I would hazard a guess that most of the women in this call would have never felt comfortable in a standard car seat because it was never designed for us, never designed for our bodies, never designed with us in mind. And so when you're developing algorithms that are, or really teaching your AI to be able to learn from the data that you're collecting, you really have to understand how that's really going to affect the output and the implications of that. And I'm sure we'll touch on security later, but really here, just on inclusive design, it's a really big factor when it comes to data collection. And then we also have issues around accessibility. So remote communities, impoverished communities who are not included in ride-hailing services, for example. So if you're on an island somewhere where Loca is not available, then you're not going to be included in that data set. And so I think it's an active, I guess, process that we have to participate in, and also to be mindful that for those who are starting out with available data sets online, a lot of these are actually not from this region. A lot of this is actually not representative of the people in our communities and experiences that we have, and are designed or at least developed or collected really from other parts of the world like US, Europe. And so this is something that you have to be extremely mindful of when you're developing your services and when you're thinking about implementing policies based on these the data analysis that comes out of it. So that's really for me, but I'm sure we'll touch more on security later.
Thank you very much, Amy. As we move to that macro, it's not just about data collection. It's not just about how much data you have, but the relevancy of the data and the inclusivity of the data. So it's a very good point that Amy shared with us. Even as we talk about privacy, and as we looked at what you were sharing earlier in terms of data management, data availability. I guess one of the issues that we also face is like what you shared briefly, data biasness and discrimination. In your view, how do you think this is affecting ASEAN? And what are the implications for policy making?
So I think that bias in, I guess, our data, especially when it's relating to AI and machine learning, is extremely prevalent now. I don't know if you all have Netflix, and a documentary came out just as I was about to talk about it the other day. And when you have data that's not representative, then by default, you are designing, or your AI technology will inadvertently be designed to serve or at least address only the issues or the needs of a very specific subset of society. And in that sense, then you have you can extrapolate that to the development of government policies where simple as vaccinations, for example, this vaccination distribution. If you're basing it around hotspots where most people are using these mobile apps, then obviously there are remote communities that might not be as equally represented. You might not collect feedback data in terms of their reactions to vaccinations, and then that can have a whole host of implications. But I think what's even more concerning, especially in the region, is really when you have data that feeds into biases about underrepresented communities or discriminated against communities, for example, refugees, undocumented immigrants who are now around the region, predominantly from Myanmar in terms of the Rohingya. And when you are developing, I guess, national policy based on algorithms that use data that selectively chooses information. So for example, you're not proactively looking to include data sets from undocumented migrants or refugees, then the redistribution of resources will almost certainly be damaging to those communities, because then resources that could have gone to helping them will be distributed elsewhere. Some of these policy decisions when it comes to the use of data or exclusion of certain data can be inadvertent, but in a lot of cases, it's actually intentional. And so this is something that a lot of governments in the region need to, or at least civil society organizations need to really proactively look at, especially when it comes to dealing with refugees and migrants. But this is also really important when it comes to things like dealing with the climate crisis. So if you are excluding, for example, emissions from imports as part of your data collection and also analysis of projections, for example, when it comes to climate mitigation, then you are not really getting an accurate representation of the policies that need to be put in place to mitigate that problem. So when it comes to non-renewable energy sources, we have a lot of countries, mine included, that are extremely dependent on the oil and gas sector, and perhaps not including the data from that sector as accurately as is required might mean that the policies that they put forward, or at least the targets they're putting forward, might not be representative of what they can technically achieve, but also what is absolutely necessary for us to be able to make significant change. And so when it comes to the type of data that's being used, we have to really concern ourselves with the intentional, selection of or selectivity of the data that they're including, especially at government level. But also when it comes to commercial uses of data in, startups, companies that are utilizing AI, the biases that come from the data sets they're depending on, for example, census data that don't include everybody, or other forms of data collection, for example, from telcos that they're using as, so I think a lot of startup ecosystems try to make these data sets freely available and collected through telcos. They might not be representative of remote communities that are not inclusive. And so when a lot of innovation is being developed that's meant to be supporting the economy and all these communities, then obviously it's not going to serve those people who are not included. And that can be extremely damaging to, for example, and we can again look at gender as a specific example, where you have urban design that doesn't include the risks that a lot of women face on a day-to-day basis. And I'll give you a simple example. When people design where public restrooms are for women, it doesn't really take into consideration some of the issues that women face. And I don't know if you've been to Europe, where a lot of the older public restrooms are underground somewhere in a really secluded area, and you think, well, who on earth designed that? So a lot of the biases that come with selectivity of data is really, it can really implicate generations. It can implicate the quality of life and the security of people across the region for a long time. And I think because of how distributed a lot of our communities are, we're not as concentrated. So for example, there are a lot of remote communities and villages in every ASEAN country. That's extremely important for us to really be mindful of as well. So I think that's really my points when it comes to biases.
Thanks very much, Amy. In hearing the different sharing, on the one hand, we see deep tech and its positive influences. We have also heard from our speakers in terms of potential issues and challenges. I see then that there is a greater need really for engagement across all sectors, engagement across different fronts, different demographics, different sectors, so that together we can build I think a more cohesive type of a environment ecosystem, and then through that to be able to see that the data and deep tech really fulfills what it was what I would think it was originally intended for. And I guess as we look at partnerships and engagement,